Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. In more than 28 years of corrections, I have used or supervised Pepperball hundreds of times. Now, as a master instructor for Pepperball, I teach others about the versatility and effectiveness of the Pepperball system. From cell extractions to disturbances on the rec yard, Pepperball is the first option in my correctional toolbox. With ranges up to 150 feet and hoppers that can hold 160 rounds, Pepperball is perfect for controlling large crowds or group disturbances on your yard. Pepperball allows for non-lethal direct impact to control inmates who refuse to comply with lawful orders, and area saturation allows you to achieve buffer zones between groups, or use it for area denial to keep inmates away from security equipment and other accessible areas. To learn more about Pepperball, go to www.pepperball.com or click the link below in this show's information guide. Pepperball is the safer option first. Well, hello, and welcome back to the Prison Officer Podcast. The other day, I ran across an article, and it was entitled, The Surprising Benefits of Going Through Difficult Times. And it started making me think about, I've never really been told that there are benefits to going through difficult times. But I've also been doing some writing lately, so I've been doing a little self-reflection and trying to figure out where I became resilient. People tell me I'm resilient. I feel like I'm resilient. 30 years in corrections, I don't think it just beat me to death. I think I still have some gumption and some life to me. But where did that resilience come from? And so I wanted to talk about that today, but I didn't want to talk about it by myself because I wanted to bring somebody in who actually understood resilience and PTSD and trauma and stuff like that. So luckily last year I was on a podcast with a now friend, Lindsay Faas. And then again, a few weeks ago, she actually interviewed my wife and my daughter about growing up with a correctional officer, which that's tough to do in itself. But I'm going to introduce Lindsay here. Lindsay Faas is a registered clinical counselor with a Master of Arts degree in counseling psychology from Trinity Western University. Her clinical work focuses on trauma-related counseling and affiliated concerns, including PTSD, complex trauma, and dissociative disorders. Lindsay also offers services related to life transitions, anxiety, depression, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, abuse, and stress management. She provides clinical supervision, professional training, and does speaking engagements. She is also the host of the Behind the Line podcast for first responders and frontline workers, and the creator of a resilience training program designed for frontline worker wellness. Lindsay currently lives in Langley, British Columbia, Canada, and welcome to the Prison Officer Podcast, Lindsay.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. It's really fun to get to flip this around.
Yeah. And with that, we got to interview me and you learned a little bit about me, but I'd like to learn just a little bit about you. Where did you grow up and where are you from?
Totally. So originally my family was from Calgary, Alberta, Canada. So prairie country, think like just north of Montana. And then as a kid, we actually moved around a lot. And so I lived for a little less than a year in Massachusetts. I lived for a little less than a year in Illinois. My parents are actually still in the States in Indiana now, along with both of my younger sisters. And I moved back to Canada as quick as I could because I had a boyfriend that I later married. And we moved out to kind of Vancouver area for grad school. And so it's been a little bit all over the map. I've done both coasts and a little bit in between.
Wow. Excellent. So what was it that when you were going probably through grad school, when did you decide you wanted to get into counseling and therapy and stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've always known that I wanted to be connected with people. I've always been a really social person. Interestingly, since doing my job, I'm far less social than I've ever been because I think I people all day and I'm probably a little bit spent at the end of it. But I always really loved problem solving. I really always loved thinking about how things worked and trying to figure things out. And the human brain is kind of like the biggest, best version of that.
Absolutely.
And I remember when I started grad school, I actually chose trauma as an area of specialization. I did my thesis work in it. All my research was around it because it felt like the hardest thing. And I thought if I could do the hardest thing, then everything else would feel easy. And then I ended up kind of falling in love with it.
So when you go talk about trauma in grad school, did that include at that time frontline workers and that, or was that something you kind of picked up?
Yeah, it was actually a lot of pieces. So I did have in mind working with frontline workers. At the time, 10, 15 years ago, even we were still really talking about PTSD largely connected to veterans and first responders. My first bit of work was actually in domestic violence. I worked for a nonprofit for a number of years, specializing in working with survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so that was kind of this other piece that I was able to do. One of the tricky things where I live is that to work with police, RCMP, Veterans Affairs, things like that, you often have to have a PhD and be a psychologist, which I am not. And so it was an area of work I really wanted to do, but couldn't do. That started to change in the last 5 or 10 years. And so I've been able to do far more of that work. And it's really, really fun work because it's a different kind of experience. Like when you're dealing with a lot of domestic violence kinds of work, it's a different kind of victimization. And it's a different kind of like helplessness and hopelessness that you see there. Whereas with first responders, there's this like very strong capacity, like this professional capacity to do a lot of things functionally.
Right.
And yet it gets eroded often over the course of time. And so a lot of the work is helping people find their way back to the resilient selves they often actually have had, that has been kind of pegged away at little by little over the course of time.
Right. When you were interviewing Kathy and Jacqueline, you made mention of the fact that in your work you see some of the frontline and first responders, they may have had trauma or difficulty or rough growing up, whatever, when they were younger and built a resilience then that kind of carried them into the work. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the really interesting facets of working with first responders and frontline workers is that there's something that gets most of us into the work to begin with, right? There's something that drives us. And often it is that like, I want to help, I want to make a difference, I want to make the world a better place. And all that's lovely, but it kind of isn't enough to keep us in work that is really, really difficult. And I would say corrections officers are like top of the list for this. I have yet to meet a corrections officer. If this exists, you're a unicorn. I have yet to meet a corrections officer that doesn't have a history of childhood trauma. And I actually think there's a really good reason that you would actually kind of need that. Because I think that anyone who was raised in a really like good, solid, loving, caring upbringing would walk into a jail and run out crying within 5 minutes. Like, I don't think you could actually be fully prepared for what it is to be in that environment. Whereas for people who grew up where there was some degree of having to be on guard a lot of the time, there was some degree of learning to have protective kinds of walls up and that guard all the time, you're prepared walking in the door. You're used to being armored up 24/7. You've got that skill set. It's innate. It was built in from little.
Right.
And so there's a different, like, this is normal. This is okay for me. I've been built for this, right? That doesn't come the same way when you haven't been trained to have some of those skills from really young.
Right. Now I remember when I started that the violence, the cussing, the all that goes on with it, that didn't surprise me. That was stuff I had seen. That was stuff I was okay with. I guess the one thing that really took me a little bit was trust. And I think I was more of a trusting person when I was younger. And then you walk into this environment where you can't hardly trust anything except for that person standing next to you that's another correctional officer. And that was when I first noticed that, I wasn't ready for that. Everybody was lying to you, you know?
Totally.
I think that I look back in history and even in military and in corrections and stuff, and there's a lot of sayings that we live by and go with. And it says, tough times make tough people. You know, that which does not kill us makes us stronger. You might even see some correctional officer T-shirts running around with that on it. So that's kind of a belief with us, you know, that we go through that, you know, you walk through the valley of death in order to get to the other side. And is that something you see when you talk to us, is that we have that belief? And does that help us when it comes time for dealing with the trauma we see? Or does it hurt us?
Such a good question. So I think the challenge is the answer is a little bit of both.
Okay.
And I think this is like the really key piece, right? Like more than anything, it's not about whether it can help or hurt. I think it's that when we have awareness of it, we can help decide which version of that it's going to be. When we are just stumbling around through our lives, hoping to goodness it works out okay, we really risk that it won't work out okay because we're not guiding and directing the okay. I a little bit talk about it like Superman, right? Superman's got all kinds of different awesome capacities. But he still gets hurt when kryptonite's around. If we don't know our kryptonite, then we have a really hard time working within our area of strength and limiting, putting a cap on how much our kryptonite hurts us. And so we kind of need to know what that is so that we can work next to it and near it without it getting in the way. Right. So the thing about, you know, experiences that have been hard for people is that it can lead us into being more resilient versions of ourselves. It can teach us really important things. It can refine aspects of us. It can be part of what brings out the very best in us. Likewise, it can also be the thing that really, really undoes us. And it's really tricky because if we're not interacting with it consciously, then we really limit how much power we have over shaping which version of that it's going to be.
Interesting. So one of the things she mentions in this article is post-traumatic growth. And that wasn't a term I've ever heard about. We always hear about post-traumatic stress, and that's a bad thing. Is there post-traumatic growth? And tell us what that is.
Yeah, 100%. So post-traumatic growth is actually a really new piece of research that's happening more and more. And you're right that probably you wouldn't have heard about it necessarily. It's something even within, for those of us working in post-traumatic stress, it's been kind of familiar for the last 10 years or so, but it hasn't gotten nearly as much attention. And to what extent is that totally typical, right? As a culture, we tend to focus on illness more than we focus on wellness. So shocker that that's where the attention goes. Post-traumatic growth is absolutely a real thing. There are lots of ways that we could probably look back on your life, my life, different experiences that were really hard and hurtful at the time. But if you track it out and think about who you are now, I would probably not be some of the coolest, best parts of me if it hadn't have been for this thing that happened back here. And while I would never willingly choose to relive that thing, because I would never have chosen it for myself to begin with, I can stand back and be grateful that it allowed these amazing things about me to emerge.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. And that's where post-traumatic growth lives.
Okay. So when we come across those, and I know we can't control everything in our lives, even though correctional officers really try. But when we come across those times where, you know, there's a trauma event, you've ran into that suicide or that inmate's injured themselves or killed somebody. I mean, we've seen all of it, or even staff suicide. Are there things that we can think about or do during that time to encourage the growth? I read in that article, it said both things happen at the same time. You know, that it's the sadness, the grief, the anger, and the anxiety are going on, but that growth goes along beside it. So it's not one or the other, right? What can we do to make that maybe a little better for us, or to understand that we are growing? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And it's a great question. I think one of the best kind of illustrations I've ever heard about post-traumatic growth is it's kind of like if you imagine a seed that's been planted in the ground, right? when it goes from seed to, small plant, on the surface of things, it would look like destruction, right? This thing that has been whole comes apart at its seams. It painfully bursts open. It births a new life. But in so doing, what it was is completely destroyed and no longer exists, right? And so this idea of post-traumatic growth happens in the course of the undoing, and it is painful often, and it is uncomfortable often, and it doesn't come without its hardship. That's kind of the point. By going through the hardship, we have this opportunity to emerge with new parts of us that are born out, that are realized, that have new opportunities to exist in the world. A big part of it is how we choose to focus our attention in those times. So if we really anchor to an identity that feels connected to victimhood in times where we've experienced something that's been really, truly awful, and we really tell and lean into a story that says, this has harmed me and I will never be okay ever again because of this thing, that will be the story. Not because it has to be the story, but because whatever story we tell ourselves is a story that's going to become real for us. Right. So there is a bit of a mindset piece in this. When we can own the hard of it, but also tell a story that says, I trust the process. I trust that there is more to this for me than just the pain and the discomfort and the awful. We have more opportunity to look for and see those places where new life is happening for us. Otherwise, we'll miss it. Right. Does that make sense?
It does. And I'm a big believer in you will become what you feed your brain. If you, that's why I rarely watch the news.
Yeah, totally.
I will go get on YouTube and watch something, some leadership deal for 30 minutes before I'll sit down and watch the news. And so it's kind of like with that, if you feed your brain that this is going to take me down, then you're going to get taken down by it. But if you feed your brain that this is a step, I learned from this. What did I learn? Now, will I do it better next time? Maybe something like that. And I do think that's the way I've looked at life as I've went through corrections. I think a lot of that stuff, when you look not just in corrections, but police and military, a lot of the greatest leaders were the people who had to overcome something. And that's why they became good leaders for others.
Totally.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
So PTSD, that's a big, it's a big topic, I know. But in corrections, and maybe you can explain this to me a little bit, PTSD for some people is a traumatic event, one. But in corrections, we have daily minor traumatic events over and over and over and over again. And that's called cumulative. Is that right?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between those and how we tend to have that cumulative?
Yes. Okay. So this is going to bring me to all of my resisting the urge to rant politically about things, but,
you're allowed
so
to
I mean, not
here.
politically in normal people world politics, but, within, academia, within psychology, there are some contentious political issues. And one of them is this idea of PTSD. So, the DSM, which is our Bible for diagnostics and how we make sense of different psychology diagnostic labels, is created by people in a room. And they get together and they sit down and they decide, yep, if you have these criteria and you tick 5 of the 7 boxes, then you meet the criteria for the thing. Unfortunately, PTSD has been one of the ones that's actually gone back a number of times over the last number of editions of the DSM. And there's quite a lot of argument within that room about how we label that one. And that's relevant because on paper, PTSD is this one diagnostic category, and you have to kind of tick the right boxes in order to get that label. And in a lot of ways, it is designed better for people who have single incident kinds of trauma to tick those boxes and get that label. The reality, though, is that for a lot of people, that's not their experience. And that's not just for first responders and frontline workers, although genuinely that's the case for most of you guys, that it would rarely be a single event that is the thing that makes that all happen. And so one of the arguments for a really long time in academic circles has been to think about PTSD less like a either you have it or you don't diagnosis, and more like on a spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum would be something we would call simple PTSD. Simple PTSD is really straightforward. It's like, I, as a grown-up human person, had one really bad thing happen to me, and it was traumatic in nature, right? Mm-hmm. Usually simple PTSD stuff is also not interpersonal. It'll be like, I was in a natural disaster, I witnessed something that was really scary, but like no one was actually trying to cause me harm. A car accident is a really good example. Typically that's not purposeful. It's an accident, right? Right. So the criteria for something like simple PTSD would be that it's a single incident. It's a one-time thing. Mm-hmm. It's non-interpersonal in nature. So it's just like a bad thing that happened. And it's adult onset. So I was a grown-up with my full brain intact to be able to make sense of the thing that happened. Mm-hmm. On the far other end of the spectrum would be something we call complex PTSD. And complex PTSD is all of the opposite of those things. So it would be repeated exposure. So I have multiple experiences of traumatic pieces. It would be young age of onset. So this happens if we have early childhood experiences of trauma all the way through our adulthood. The younger we are when those repeated experiences start, the more vulnerable we are. And that it would be interpersonal in nature. So we actually do have people we have to make sense of who are trying to cause harm to me, which is a very different type of problem to try to make sense of in our brains than bad things sometimes happen, right?
Right.
Within that spectrum, there would be a lot of gray. And where you guys fall could be in a lot of that gray space. When we move from simple PTSD, we move from things that are pretty easy and straightforward to try to recover from into things that become much more nuanced to try to recover from, because we are trying to wrap our heads around problems that we were never meant to experience, right? We were never meant to have our nervous systems in constant states of elevated preparedness for trauma and stress. That's actually not what bodies are wired to do. We weren't wired to be kids trying to make sense of really hard experiences and problems. Mm-hmm. We weren't built for some of these things. So the further down this trajectory we get, the harder it is to do recovery pieces around. Right. And it does become this like, you know, when I've had a few of those experiences, I maybe was able to be resilient that time, and then again that time, and then again that time. But as they continue to add and wear, it gets harder. It gets harder to continue to have the mindset that says, how do I find growth in this? When we start to feel like I'm the common denominator, right? Like bad things just happen to me. They're going to continue to happen to me. They're going to always happen to me. And that's where we get more risk of falling into that victim kind of mentality that does then catalyze far more of that tendency towards post-traumatic stress.
Interesting. One of the things that you just said that kind of resonates with me is taking it personal. And I think I've seen that in my career. You know, I grew up, and don't get me wrong, anybody that's listening, I don't have anything against my father, but my father was a former Marine, and when I got in trouble, he was nose to nose with me, screaming at me, and I was used to that by the time I got to work, got to the military, got to corrections. That wasn't that big a deal to have somebody stand nose to nose with me and do that. And I remember early on, there was this inmate that was just, every time I walked by his cell, it was just bam, bam, bam. He had something to say to me. And I talked to an old hack there, and he said, well, quit worrying about it. That's his job. And I think I think I took that to heart. That wasn't that inmate, and it wasn't personal. That was that inmate's job, to be an ass, to be an inmate, to be a whatever. And my job was to keep him inside the fence. And I think I broke it down in my mind pretty easily that way. But now that you say that, I do see other, and I'm just talking about what I saw, but I see a lot of people who take that personally. That, you know, this inmate did this on my shift because I was there. as
Mhm.
opposed to this inmate's being an inmate. And if
Yeah.
anybody had been there, it'd have been the same, whether it's a suicide or whether it's just that mouthy stuff that we listen to, 24/7. So that's really
Yeah.
interesting that you said it's how you take it personally.
I mean, the reality is that brains are wired for stories. So we will tell a story regardless of whether that story is true. And it's because our brains really like to fill the gap in a story. So part of the risk is that how we tell the story dictates how we then feel about our story
Hmm.
and dictates how we're going to respond next, even if that's totally out of whack with what's really going on around us, right?
Right.
So, like, I'll often have clients who come in and they'll tell me, like, Lindsay, here's my life story. They'll lay it all out. And what they've surmised from that is, this must mean that I'm unlovable and unworthy and I'm bad and I'm gross and I'm all of these things. And it's fascinating because I'm sitting there listening to their story going, hold on a second. That's not the story I hear. I hear the
Yeah.
story of someone who, despite having people in their lives who were not equipped to do what they needed to do for you, you found ways to like survive and grow relationships and have healthful connections and have a meaningful job and, right, like meet your kids where they're at and do these amazing things. So tell me about how your story and my story go together, because we got a gap here. And it's fascinating to me that this is the story you've chosen to tell yourself when I don't think that's the only version of a story there is to tell.
That's cool. That's interesting the way you've talked to people about that, because I think they do get that mixed up. They don't see the positive, and it's hard in corrections. It's hard to see the positive,
Yeah,
because you're
totally.
surrounded by that negative, but they absolutely are successful. And sometimes you have to look outside of work. People are used to looking to their work, as this is where I'm successful at. And I think in corrections, you can't do that as much. At least for me, until I became a supervisor. And when I made that step onto supervisor, and then I got to take care of other people and I got to make work better for them, then I think that's when I started letting work be a positive thing for me as opposed to a negative thing.
Okay.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I
So-
do think that there is a bit of a piece of like, I'm actually having this conversation right now because we take on interns every year here at our clinic, and we just took on 2 new interns that have just started with us. And this is a conversation I find myself having every year with new students around how do we measure ourselves? How do we measure a good day as a therapist? Because often you'll have clients who are really doing not well. And so if you're measuring yourself, your professional performance by your client's okayness,
Right.
you ain't going to feel okay a lot of the time, right? Like, it's not a helpful measure. You could have had an amazing session where you did all the best right things, and your client could still be depressed and maybe suicidal.
Right.
And we can't rescue that. Like, we have you for 1 hour once a week, maybe. What can we do in that time frame, right? So, like, we're often having these conversations about how do we create a different measuring system for what success means and what success looks like. Because if we're dictating it off of them, we're never going to feel okay. Right. And I imagine that in that line of work, it would be very similar. Like, it's not going to get dictated by how inmates are feeling. That's not a thing. Right. Like, it's not going to be dictated by how they treat me nicely, because that's not like, none of these are relevant measurements. So how do we measure our sense of what my role is? Did I keep everyone as safe as I could today? Did I keep everyone as in check as I could today? Did I do that in a way that was respectful of humanity while also respecting, like, this is the job?
Yeah.
Those need to maybe then be the measures instead that we're judging ourselves by.
I always, and I can go back to several of them. Maybe I was just stuck on quotes and stuff, but the old hacks, they used to say stuff. And as I got older, it makes more sense. And I just remembered one that while you're talking, and one of them told me one day, he turned and looked back at the prison. He says, "Everybody in?" I said, yeah, we cleared count, on the way out. He said, "Are you going home vertically?" I said, "Yeah." So it's a good day. I mean, he broke it down that simple. And a lot of those old hacks that lasted through those years broke that stuff down that simple. They didn't get off into the weeds.
Yeah.
You know, we did what we could do. We did it the best we could do. And now it's time to go home, go work on his farm. And, you know, I've worked with a lot of correctional officers tend to have farms or businesses, you know, outside of work. And I think that's where they focus all that energy that they need to do something positive.
Yeah.
Yeah. When I know that you see a lot of correctional officers and talk to them. So what's some of the stuff that you've learned about us? Not specifically, but just generally. What have you learned about us? Is that just a huge question?
It's a loaded question. No, I love it though. It's a good question.
Nobody's got.
I mean, I would say that the one universal thing I've seen, and I have yet to find anyone who proves me wrong about this, is that every single one of you come from some kind of childhood. Yeah. I would love to meet the person who's in it who doesn't. And I would be fascinated to hear their story about how they got into it and why they stuck it out, given that. Because I think that the people who are equipped to do the thing have to come from that background. Like I have one corrections officer client I often joke with, and it's a terrible joke, but you guys have dark humor, so you'll hopefully be fine with it. Where I say, like, we have to have bad families and broken children, because otherwise who would do this job? And like, we all know culturally, societally, we need people who do this job.
Right.
Thank goodness for terrible, awful, broken families, because it's the only way we have that. It's tricky because it's where the capacity to do a thing as hard as what you guys do lives. The unfortunate thing is, I think there's ways that then we actually put you at increased risk. Again, as a society, as a culture, we put you in this position to do a job where you can kind of take what you've learned as kids and be awesome and do amazing things that most of us couldn't do. But you're also differently vulnerable to the wear and tear of that as a result of that long-standing history. And if we're not caring really well for you, then I think we're failing you guys. And unfortunately, because the work you do is something that the rest of us would like to close our eyes to and pretend doesn't exist,
right, you
guys get backburnered a lot. And I think that we do a huge disservice to you guys as a result of that. Beyond that, what I've learned about y'all is you're super skeptical.
Yes, ma'am. I don't know. I've been retired for years.
I know.
I have not got rid of that yet either. But
it's so funny because it's interesting as someone who really genuinely wants to help and care. I remember when I first came out with my resilience training course, it was fascinating because in my head, I was like, oh, this is going to be so helpful. People who don't want to go to therapy because therapy is like all the stigma-y things can like do this course, and it'll be like a really nice way to step into some of the pieces you would get from therapy without having to do therapy. I thought it was such a great idea. And then I tried to market it, and I had so much resistance, and I was like, oh, right. I misstepped here. I forgot that you guys are all the like, don't sell me something. Don't.
Yeah.
It's fascinating.
And I know what they felt as soon as there was something on there that asked a question. My brain goes, why do you want to know that? Because that's the way we live.
Totally.
You know? Yeah,
totally.
We live that way because we're going to get manipulated. We get manipulated thousands of times a day. So even the people that have worked a long time in corrections, you know, a lot of times you won't see them on social media. You won't see bumper stickers on their cars because they don't want anybody to know what they think. And inmates know. People don't realize this. The public doesn't. But I've had inmates, and they look out the windows outside that prison. Hey, did you get a new truck? I saw you coming into work today. They're watching us walk in. They know what's on our vehicles. Yeah. They know what the pictures on our desk are. And so we do. We get skeptical because we don't want that manipulation. Yeah.
Totally.
So let me ask you about this because I see this a lot at work. And we talked a little bit about taking it personally, and we talked a little bit about manipulation. Yeah. And those inmates are so good at directing stuff towards you and finding out what that little weak spot is. That's the manipulation. You know, if they see that you're a family person, they'll threaten your family. If they see that, you know, that you blow up when something political, well, they'll be drawing signs, to put on their walls, or they'll be saying that stuff to get you to blow, to show emotion. And I worked in a mental health unit for 14 years, and that was the number one thing. If you could show emotion, they won that day. Yeah. Well, you got any tips on how, when we walk through there, we can minimize that effect, minimize people getting to us? Does that make sense? You got any tips on that?
It really does. I mean, okay, so the thing about emotional reactivity is it happens in parts of your brain that are real survival instincty kinds of bits and pieces, right? So they get activated really quickly. The best way to try to contain them is to really work on strengthening your executive functioning. Now, executive functioning is the stuff that lives right up here at the very front of your brain. It's the stuff that makes us different than other primates. So language, decision-making, problem solving, things like sequencing, the order that we do things in, stuff like that. So often when I am training people to do things like move themselves out of panic attacks or reduce anxiety, regulate their emotions. I actually do this with my kids all the time. I've got one kid in particular who's like an emotional roller coaster. Same premise, right? We're trying to get this part of our brain on, because when we get that on, it shushes some of the parts of our brain that get emotionally reactive. And so anything that focuses on information tasks. So this is the one I do with my 6-year-old daughter. You can do versions of this for grown-ups. So I will look at her and I will say, I bet you can't find me 3 things in this room that are purple. And she will be looking, she'll scan, and she'll like, that's purple, and that's purple, and that's purple. And I'll say, bet you can't find me 3 words that start with the letter R, which then I have to remind her that R makes a R sound because we're 6, and that's still hard. But I've done versions of this with adults where I've said, tell me 3 countries that start with the letter C. Tell me what 13 times 4 is. Tell me the name of 2 oceans. Tell me, just random informational pieces that connect to language and numbers are all things that this part of your brain really likes. And when you make the front part of your brain work harder, it actually has to take resources away from the parts of your brain that are doing the emotional activation. So it shushes them by actually taking resourcing away from those parts of your brain by putting more pressure on a part of your brain that doesn't need that. So that's an in-the-moment tool.
Right.
On the flip side, when you go home, you need to leave space for some of those things so that you still have humanity. Yeah.
Yeah. And I know I've talked to several officers over the years, and a lot of times we live a little ways from the prison, and sometimes we like that because we get that drive and we can think, I've done both. I've lived close and I've lived, an hour away.
Yeah.
And you need that decompression time. You need that time to reset your brain, I guess, is kind of what you're doing. Ready to walk in and hear daddy, and be able to smile because you haven't been, and drop some of that manipulation that's been, you've been expecting. So how's
totally.
I know you said that you have, that we're very skeptical. How do you get around that with us? What is it that, and I'm thinking more of the families here, is there, cause there's a lot of families that listen to this. I get, emails from the wives and stuff. What can we do as a family of a correctional officer to remember? I know one of them is, and my wife and I talked about this, don't run straight up to daddy. And we talked about this,
Oh,
and one of those was sometimes so I could get my uniform off and leave it in the garage before they touched me, which is a strange thing for a kid to understand. Totally. Yeah. But it also gives you that, that moment, or that, what is it? You're kind of easing back into it. Do you have any tips there for the family on the things they can do to help?
I mean, I think it's a little bit both sides, right? So there's things that the family can be doing. There's also things I think that you guys need to be doing to make that transition easier for them too. And it's always this catch-22. And honestly, I've had this conversation with so many people where corrections officers will say something like, it's really hard because my family doesn't get what I do. And then at the same time, when I'm like, well, if they did, what would that be like? And they're like, well, I wouldn't want them to.
Right.
Well, then you can't hold it against them. Right? Like, we can't have it both ways. We can't go like, oh man, I feel so alone and isolated because they don't get it.
True.
And then simultaneously say, but I wouldn't want them to get it. And we can feel that, but it's really hard to hold others accountable to that then, because we're the ones putting them in this no-win situation.
Right.
Right. So what are the pieces that I would need them to understand? I might not need them to understand the like nitty gritty of what I did and saw and interacted with today. But I might need them to understand some of the broader challenges that I face, some of the broader themes of what it's like to be me and live a day in my shoes. And probably we need to be having more of those conversations, because how they can develop empathy and find ways to support us in that only lives by them being informed about it.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
On the flip side, I think that it also behooves families to seek to do some understanding. And that's the really hard place, is how do you find ways to connect about the work, but also ways to connect that has nothing to do with the work, right? So like one of the things we talk about a lot in our family, I can't talk about a lot of the work that I do, even though it is quite impactful for me at times.
Of course.
Certainly there's lots of hard things I see in a day and hear in a day and interact with in a day. Some of it has to do with, like, I see a lot of police officers who work in our community. So I'll know about things before they hit the news. I'll know about things that are happening in our community that I would want my family to know about, but I actually can't let my family know that I know about them.
Sure.
So there's all kinds of pieces that I find I have to contain in terms of an information standpoint. But I can come home and talk about, like, you know, mommy had to do some hard things today. Mommy's brain isn't totally ready to have conversations about these things, or like, don't ask me about Minecraft. I'm not into it right now. And we can have conversations about, like, my kids know that mommy helps people we talk about mommy's job is to help people with hurting hearts feel happy again. That's the language we've used with our kids. But because of that, they understand that mommy's job is lots of hurting people who don't always feel happy again right away. And sometimes when we're around not happy people, we start to feel less happy.
Right.
But then part of their interest is, okay, well, if you're having a not so happy day, what can we do to like work together to be happier? So we'll find like transition activities, right? We have some rules about like, don't jump up on me the first moment I run home either. I also have some like transition down things at the end of my day so that I feel ready to be like mom had again. But we also have like, today's a puzzle day. And the kids know that puzzle day means like mommy is not prepared to like go run around jumping up at the basketball hoop. Mommy is not prepared to like do all of the like pretend play kitchen things today. It's a puzzle day. So get me a puzzle. Let's sit and puzzle. I'll pour us some hot chocolate and we'll chill. And that's a way that we can still have connection and like bridge back to joy and calm and like this time where we're connected without feeling like it's so like such a big leap from where we were to where we're being asked to be.
Yeah,
So like transition pieces for you, but transition pieces for them.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm envisioning myself, because I would sit down with my boy and we would play video games. Now, I don't think your life should be taken over by video games, but that was an easy way for me to still interact and still be in my own brain while I was finishing up stuff.
Yeah.
You know? So that's interesting. You talk about games, puzzles, things you can do like that. Wow.
Or like, I mean, the hilarity is like, if I'm coming home on an agitated day, my next version of that is like, everyone grab the Nerf gun goggles and run. We're going to have an all house Nerf gun fight, and I'm going to get out my frustration of this day, and we're all going to laugh and feel better for it.
Oh yeah. That's a great one. I don't think they had Nerf guns when my kids were little. I don't know. But yeah.
Oh my gosh. They're just
cool.
so very satisfying. We find them in the weirdest places in our house.
And for you correctional officers out there, that does not mean paintball with your young children.
Right. But teenagers, though, that's probably solid.
Yeah, absolutely. No, anything you can
Right?
do.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you for coming on here and answering some of those questions. I knew it wasn't a subject that I wanted to talk about completely. I mean, I had some thoughts and some ideas about it, but I needed somebody to walk me through that. And I think a lot of people will get something out of what you had to say and maybe learn from that and be able to be more resilient at work, because it's that resiliency that gets us through. It absolutely is. What are you working on now, Lindsay? Will you do anything new? I know you're doing podcasts.
I mean, there is always something.
Yeah.
There's always something new. I mean, right now, our biggest focal point is our clinic is working on some big projects of our own. And we're actually looking to move in the next year or so. So right now, a lot of my time and energy is focused on some planning pieces for that. But on the side of all of the other things, the podcast is still a thing I am loving doing. It's such a fun way to get to direct some of the things that are happening in session and make that feel like it's more accessible to people broader than that. Yeah. The course continues to be a thing that I love and am working on. We actually adapted the resilience training program, used to be a self-paced course entirely. We're now kind of shifting it and adding a version where people actually have access to like live Q&A calls, and the ability to have access to a community platform where they're able to connect with each other and with me to try to really get the learning out of the material and personalize it and make it really real in their lives. So that's been really fun and exciting too.
Yeah. And they can do that online, right? I mean,
yeah.
Okay, so you're in Canada, and if somebody's in the U.S. here, they can still go through that course. I didn't know.
Yeah, we're actually in conversations with law enforcement bodies across the country right now to try to see if we can find ways to bridge that into their education and training for the U.S.
Excellent. Yeah, if you haven't listened to the Behind the Line podcast, you should. Lindsay has a lot of great conversations with firefighters and police and correctional officers and their families and others. I didn't know until I was getting ready for this podcast. I looked up, it says our staff. You have a lot of staff there. There's a bunch of people working there. So lots of resources and lots of help if somebody needs to reach out. And if they want to reach out, where can they reach you at?
Yeah, so I am easily found on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Lindsay A. Faas. I can also be found by just simply Googling my name. And probably easiest via email is support@thrive-life.ca.
Excellent. And I'll put those links in the show notes for everyone. Anybody who wants to contact Lindsay and learn a little bit more. So thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I appreciate you, and hope to see you again soon.
Sounds good. It's great to be here. Thanks so much.
Excellent. If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcasts, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.